what I remember most importantly is that, we're talking the mid-'80s here. This is all, pre-social media. It was a different time, a different ball game in that sense. But of course, my job was that I was recruited to set up the security for William's new school in North London called Wetherby. And at this point, I hadn't met any member of the royal family, and having sort of successfully passed all the training scenarios that one had to go through to get this job. I remember driving up to Sandringham House in Norfolk, where Diana and the Prince of Wales, as he was then, were on a holiday, a vacation. And I was there to meet Diana. And I remember being shown into this room at Sandringham, somewhat nervous at the prospect of seeing and meeting Diana and the two young princes. And as I was shown in, William was playing a piano, I might add, incredibly badly. And Harry was stood on a table like this, destamenising this vase of royal lilies. And once this very attentive butler had introduced me to Diana, she said, "I don't envy you, Ken, looking after my children. They can be a bloody nuisance." At which point William turned round from playing the piano and said, "I'm not a bloody nuisance or anything else." And Harry said something similar. At which point he falls off the table, followed by this vase of lilies. And of course Diana gets up and says, "Come here," and chases them out of the room. And actually I hadn't said anything. But that sort of parental, motherly approach sort of really set the scene for me, because when Diana returned, it was actually like seeing somebody you'd known for a long, long time. And, in that process, she sort of broke the ice. And that was my introduction to Diana, their mother, and working for the royal family. And from there on, actually, life was very, very enjoyable, I have to say that.
What were the boys like when they were young then, at the time that you spent with them? Was there any sense, Harry's mentioned in Spare about, how he often felt that there was friction between him and his older brother as they grew up, and that William would get preferential treatment. But what was your feeling spending so much time with the two princes? With their personalities, for instance, back then in the 80s, what were they like?
Well, but actually, in the 80s, that time, when they were aged 5 and 3 respectively, and although I actually left them after a period of 6 months, I was still very much involved within their life cycle, in terms of that, of course, Diana would take them to school. It was a very happy unit. It was a very happy family. What I will say is that, Diana and her husband at that time were going through a very difficult period of their life. But both of them, didn't want their, situation to be known by the children. Of course not. And actually, they knew they had a blissful, happy life at that point. But Harry was always the joker, the entertainer. And I suppose really it would be quite common really for, the sort of sibling rivalry that there was, for the eldest, William, to be slightly nervous or envious of Harry because he was so popular. But he was, he was the entertainer. You could almost say he was the court jester at that time. And so in that sense, I think William found it slightly different. But they were funny. What I liked about Diana, what I liked about, the prince himself, the way that they educated their children, albeit in rather extreme privileged circumstances. They had a very, very good upbringing in that sense. And Diana was very careful to, and sort of insisted that they had a normal life. She'd take them to burger bars, I remember Bill Wyman's Sticky Fingers in Ken High Street was a favourite of theirs. She openly encouraged, sort of tea with their own peer group and so forth. And likewise, friends would come back to Kensington Palace. So in that sense, there was a normality there. But no, I just witnessed an upbringing that was about as normal as you were going to get within, the confines of a royal family. One thing that Diana didn't want, she wanted her children to go to a normal school. Well, you could argue that Wetherby probably not normal, it was a fee-paying pre-preparatory. But that was about the best that Diana could get. There was no way he was going to go to the local comprehensive, although that might have been a good idea. But it was a fun time, no doubt about that.
But knowing what you knew, knowing what we know now, the brothers don't speak. Was there any indication when you were working with them that there was this kind of sibling rivalry that would end up in a situation where two previously close brothers are basically sworn enemies?
No, I think there's sort of there's this sort of breakup of sibling relationship. I think this all began really about the time of Harry's marriage to Meghan. I mean, sort of much later in life, because up until that point, certainly up until the point of, you know, their mother's death, you know, they were very much at one. I mean, you know, they entertained each other. They were very much involved in each other's friends. You know, but again, right through that early part of the life, you know, Harry was always the most popular. But to be fair to Diana and their father, you know, there was never any preference shown. I mean, they were treated, you know, very fairly. I remember one incident actually going down to Highgrove one weekend, which was a normal Friday night journey. And they clearly had an argument in the nursery beforehand. And as we came out of the front doors of Kensington Palace, there's the nanny, the late Olga Powell, who was, you know, an incredibly interesting nanny of the old school. And, you know, would dish out, you know, very gentle corporal punishment. And clearly Harry and William had a barney, as I say. They get in the car, and Diana sort of said, look, if you carry on like this, we're not going. You know, we stay in London. If you could just behave like this, we're not going anywhere. And I think we're halfway down the M4, and they started again. And there's Olga sat in the middle of the back seat, refereeing this argument. And then suddenly Harry turns across to William. He said, it's all right for you, he said. You'll be king one day and you can do what you want. And furthermore, he said, I'll do what I want. And I looked at Diana, I was in the front seat, and she looked at me and she said, where the hell did he get that from? And, you know, it was funny, but I always thought interesting that children at that age, that he could have a thought process at that age to say to his brother, who he knew would be king, and William thought, you know, he knew he would be king at some point. We're talking about a 6, 7-year-old talking to his brother 4 or 5. But anyway, we didn't go back to London, but quite interesting.
Mm. What do you think, so Diana was sat in the car with you and she was listening to the two boys talk about that. How do you think, is it impossible to say, but how do you think Diana would feel knowing that these two previously close brothers are basically at war?
Yeah, I think the sad thing is that you know, of Diana's death, that was a traumatic experience, certainly for them. You know, they lose their mother so publicly. And in Harry's particular case, as I think it was a 13, 14-year-old, he is, out of a sense of duty, has to sort of walk behind his mother's coffin to Westminster Abbey, which is a discussion in itself.
Well, you were there, weren't you, actually, at the...
I was at Westminster Abbey, and I remember, you know, the coffin arriving with Harry having walked nearly a mile through the Royal Mile, as it were, to Westminster Abbey. But up until that point, and I think even after that point, they remained good friends. And I think that, to answer your question, how would Diana have influenced, you know, or had any influence on resolving their issues in later life? I think she would have been, because what this turmoil needed, or needs even now, I think, is someone to convene and try and sort this out. And it's never going to be sorted out publicly, it has to be sorted out privately.